In the spring of 1815, the island of Sumbawa was a tropical jewel, a place of vibrant life and ancient stillness. But deep beneath the roots of the jungle, a cataclysm was preparing to rewrite the history of the world. Mount Tambora, a sleeping giant, stood as a silent sentinel over the East Indies, unaware that its coming breath would extinguish the sun for millions across the globe, launching a chain of events that would define the most desperate year in human memory. The explosion was a thunderclap that shook the foundations of the earth. Tambora vanished into a pillar of fire and ash, launching hundreds of cubic miles of debris into the stratosphere. It was a roar that signaled the end of the old world and the beginning of a cold, gray reality that no one was prepared to face. The debris did not fall back to Earth. Instead, it formed a toxic shroud of sulfuric acid that began to encircle the planet. This invisible veil, carried by high-altitude winds, acted as a mirror, reflecting the sun's warmth back into space. The world was about to be plunged into an artificial winter, a silent, global dimming that would starve the land of its vital energy, turning fertile valleys into frozen wastelands before the first survivors even realized the cause. By the early months of 1816, the effects reached the shores of North America. In the heart of summer, the expected warmth never arrived. Farmers in New England woke to find their cornfields brittle and blackened by a sudden, impossible frost in July. The air remained biting and cold, a seasonal anomaly that felt like a divine curse. The cycle of growth had been broken, replaced by a gray, sunless sky that refused to provide the heat necessary for life to flourish. As the weeks passed, the confusion turned into cold, hard realization. Men who had spent their lives tilling the soil now stood in heavy winter coats amidst their ruined harvests, staring at the withered remains of their livelihoods. The silence of the fields was more terrifying than any storm they had ever encountered. Across the Atlantic, the great cities of Europe were swallowed by a persistent, sickly yellow fog. In London, the midday sun was a pale, ghostly disk that provided no light or warmth. Pedestrians navigated the cobblestone streets with lanterns, moving through a thick atmosphere of volcanic dust and urban coal smoke. The atmosphere was heavy with a metallic tang, and the persistent chill seeped into the very stone of the buildings, creating a sense of impending, global doom. In the absence of scientific explanation, many turned to the divine. Churches were filled with the sound of desperate prayers as congregations sought mercy from what they perceived as the wrath of God. The sun's disappearance was interpreted as a sign of the end times, a celestial warning that the balance of nature had been irrevocably tilted. Behind every prayer was the gnawing fear that the summer would never return, and that the world was destined to remain in this frozen twilight forever. Every flicker of light became a precious resource in the growing darkness. Families huddled around single lamps, watching the flame dance against the encroaching cold. The struggle to keep the darkness at bay was a microcosm of the global fight for survival, as the light of civilization itself felt increasingly fragile in the face of the volcanic winter. The economic pulse of the world began to fail as the grain silos sat empty. In the marketplaces, the price of bread skyrocketed beyond the reach of the common man, sparking riots and desperate protests. Merchants stood over empty stalls, their faces etched with the stress of a collapsing supply chain. The social fabric, once held together by the abundance of the harvest, was now fraying under the pressure of a global famine that no amount of gold could resolve. Then came the snows of June. In parts of Europe and America, massive blizzards buried the landscape in several feet of ice when the world should have been in full bloom. The sight of snow on green leaves was a haunting image of a nature turned inside out, a visual testament to the power of a volcano thousands of miles away to freeze the world in its tracks. Behind every frosted window, the same question was asked: when would the nightmare end? The eyes of the survivors reflected not just the dim candlelight, but a profound loss of hope. They were witnesses to a year that had lost its identity, a time when the sun had been stolen, and the only certainty was the relentless, biting cold. Even the great oceans were not spared from the chill. Sailing ships, the primary engines of global trade, found themselves trapped in unseasonable sea ice, their hulls creaking under the pressure of the frozen deep. The sea, once a highway of empire, had become a prison of ice. As the first block of our story concludes, we find a world on the brink of collapse, frozen in time, and starving for a sun that remained hidden behind a veil of volcanic ash. By the midsummer of 1816, the pastoral landscapes of Europe and North America had turned into mass graveyards. The livestock, unable to find pasture beneath the unseasonable frost, began to perish by the thousands. Farmers stood over their skeletal cattle in utter silence, watching their primary source of food and labor vanish into the frozen earth. It was a harvest of bone and hide, a devastating blow to a society that lived and died by the health of its animals. As the granaries ran dry, the sound of wood scraping against wood became the hollow anthem of the hungry. Every last grain was a diamond, every seed a desperate hope for a tomorrow that seemed increasingly unlikely. The bottom of the bin was finally visible, a terrifying sight that signaled the true beginning of the famine. Desperation soon gave birth to a mass exodus. Entire villages were abandoned as families packed their meager belongings into bundles and took to the muddy, frozen roads. They were the first climate refugees of the modern era, fleeing the starving highlands of Switzerland and the frost-bitten hills of Vermont. They moved like shadows through a landscape that no longer sustained them, searching for a legendary land of plenty while the cold wind bit through their thin rags. The journey was a brutal test of endurance. Heavy carts, loaded with the remnants of broken lives, sank deep into the mire of roads that had never thawed. The struggle to move forward was a physical battle against a world that had turned hostile, where every mile gained was paid for with the last of their waning strength. The silence of the wilderness was absolute. Birds had vanished, and the usual hum of summer insects was replaced by the soft, unrelenting hiss of falling snow. The natural world had retreated into a forced hibernation, leaving the human travelers alone in a vast, white void that seemed to have no end. Inside the hovels of the poor, the menu of survival grew increasingly grim. Families huddled around small iron pots, sharing a thin, watery soup made of boiled nettles, bark, and even the leather of old shoes. There was no conversation, only the sound of wooden spoons hitting the bottom of bowls. Every meal was a calculated delay of the inevitable, a desperate attempt to keep the spark of life flickering in bodies that were being slowly consumed by the lack of nourishment and the invading cold. In the cities, the arrival of the starving masses was met with iron gates and bayonets. Governments, still reeling from the Napoleonic Wars, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the disaster. Soldiers stood guard over city walls, pushing back the waves of beggars who had come seeking bread. The social order was beginning to fracture, as the elite hoarded what little was left, while the streets filled with those who had lost everything to the volcanic winter. News of the disaster spread as fast as the cold. Letters filled with accounts of the year without a summer crossed the oceans, carrying stories of ice in July and birds falling dead from the sky. These written records became the only evidence of a catastrophe that the world was still struggling to understand. For many, the only hope lay across the sea. Ports were crowded with families who had sold their last possessions for a ticket on a cramped sailing vessel. They looked back at their homelands one last time, a view obscured by the persistent gray mist and the driving rain. These ships were vessels of both hope and despair, carrying the seeds of new nations to distant shores, driven by the cold winds of a planet that had momentarily forgotten how to provide for its children on the land they knew. The tolling of the church bells became a constant sound in the valley. It was a rhythmic reminder of the lives being lost to the cold and the hunger, a funeral march for an era that was ending in frost. The sound echoed off the hills, a lonely cry for help that seemed to vanish into the thick, ash-laden clouds above. Strength was a finite resource that many exhausted before reaching safety. In the middle of frozen fields and lonely roads, many simply reached their limit and surrendered to the earth. The leather pouch, once containing the savings of a lifetime, lay empty in the snow, a final symbol of a struggle that had been lost. The day ended with sunsets of a terrifying and unnatural beauty. The volcanic ash in the stratosphere scattered the light into deep crimsons, bruised purples, and eerie oranges that felt like a vision of the end of the world. These blood skies were a constant, haunting reminder of the fire that had started it all. As night fell over a starving world, The survivors could only wait in the dark, wondering if the next dawn would bring the return of the sun, or just another day of eternal winter. As the physical world crumbled, the human psyche began to fracture under the weight of the endless gloom. In the summer of 1816, a group of writers gathered at Villa Diodati by Lake Geneva, trapped indoors by the relentless, freezing rain. The atmosphere was thick with the sense of cosmic dread, as the sun remained hidden behind a veil of ash. In this claustrophobic darkness, the shadows of the mind began to take shape, giving birth to a new kind of storytelling that mirrored the cold world. Mary Shelley sat in the flickering shadows, her mind haunted by visions of life created from death. The biting cold and the unnatural storms provided the perfect backdrop for her imagination to wander into the macabre. Each stroke of her pen was a response to the terrifying world that seemed to be dying around her. Out of this volcanic winter, a monster was born. Frankenstein's creature was not just a product of science, but a reflection of the era's profound anxiety about the power of nature and the fragility of life. The monster, wandering through frozen landscapes in search of a creator who abandoned him, became a symbol for a humanity that felt forgotten by the sun. The icy wasteland was not a fantasy. It was the reality of 1816, captured in prose that would haunt the world for centuries to come. In the humbler homes, the stories were even darker. Families told tales of the end of days, as the persistent darkness fueled old superstitions and new fears. The fire in the hearth was the only thing standing between them and the void, its light a fragile shield against the growing psychological weight of the eternal winter. The mental toll of the disaster was visible in the crowded asylums of the era. The lack of sunlight and the constant threat of starvation pushed many to the brink of madness. The world had become a prison of gray, where the mind struggled to find a reason to hope amidst the unrelenting cold and the silence of the fields. On every street corner, prophets of doom emerged to explain the unexplainable. Preachers claimed that the darkening of the sun was a direct result of human sin, calling for mass repentance before final judgment. The desperate crowds, looking for any meaning in the chaos, listened in a trance of fear. These religious movements spread like wildfire through the starving populations, creating a climate of fanatical devotion and volatility that threatened to topple traditional structures of authority. While some looked to the heavens for judgment, others sought scientific truth. Astronomers noted unusual spots on the sun, leading many to believe the star itself was dying. Without knowledge of the distant Indonesian eruption, the scientific community was divided, and their public debates only added to the general unease. The sun, once the reliable clock of the universe, had become a source of terror and mystery, its fading light a puzzle that even the greatest minds could not solve. The mirror reflected a humanity that was being slowly hollowed out. Physical hunger was accompanied by a deep, spiritual exhaustion that drained the color from the world. Every man and woman was a survivor of a psychological war, fighting to maintain their sanity in a world that no longer made any sense. Knowledge itself seemed to be failing. The old ways of farming, the traditional understanding of the seasons, and belief in a predictable world were all shattered. Libraries and universities were silent, as the immediate need for bread replaced the pursuit of wisdom. The intellectual progress of the Enlightenment was momentarily stalled by the primal need for survival, leaving the world in a state of intellectual and spiritual limbo as the volcanic winter continued to exert its iron grip. The closing of the book was a metaphor for the closing of an era. The certainty of the past was gone, replaced by a dark, unwritten future. As the ink dried on the accounts of the disaster, the world waited in a state of suspended animation, caught between a history that had failed and a future that had yet to arrive. The physical and mental landscapes merged into a single vision of chaos. The violent sea, reflecting the absence of the moon and stars, became a canvas for the collective fear of the era. It was a world without boundaries, where the darkness of the sky was matched only by the darkness of the human heart in its struggle to endure. Even the art of the time turned melancholic, Poets wrote of darkness, describing a world where the bright sun was extinguished, and the icy earth swam blind and blackening in the moonless air. These works were not mere metaphors, but literal transcriptions of the atmosphere of 1816. As the third block ends, we see a humanity that has survived the initial shock, only to find itself wandering in a psychological wasteland, where ghosts of the old world still haunt the frozen present. As the last reserves of grain vanished, the thin veneer of civilization finally cracked. In the hungry streets of Europe, the desperate silence of the morning was shattered by the sound of breaking glass. Hunger had turned law-abiding citizens into a force of nature, driven by a primal need that no decree could silence. The riots had begun, and the world was about to learn the true price of bread. The bakeries, once symbols of community and warmth, became the primary targets of the mob's fury. After the chaos, only the ghosts of sustenance remained. White flour lay scattered across the dark floor like an ironic mockery of the snow falling outside, while the empty shelves stood as hollow monuments to a failed system. For the rioters, it was a desperate act of survival in a world that had seemingly decided to let them starve in the dark, turning friends into rivals for the last loaf. To protect the remaining hordes of wealth, the state responded with iron. The rhythmic thud of military boots on the slush-covered cobblestones signaled the arrival of martial law. Governments, fearing a total revolution fueled by famine, deployed their bayonets against the very people they were meant to protect, turning the freezing city squares into tense zones of potential slaughter. Behind the heavy stone walls of high-security warehouses, the elite guarded the world's most valuable currency, grain. While the masses fought for crumbs in the streets, a hidden economy of hoarding flourished in the shadows. Armed sentries watched every entrance, their muskets gleaming in the dim lantern light. The stark division of resources deepened the resentment of the starving, creating a social powder keg that threatened to ignite with the slightest spark of further misfortune. Justice in the year without a summer was swift and unforgiving. Gaunt men and women, caught stealing a loaf of bread or handful of potatoes, were brought before judges who prioritized property over the necessity of life. The cold halls of the courts offered no warmth or mercy. For many, the choice was simple but impossible: to die of hunger in the streets or face the gallows for the crime of trying to stay alive for one more day. The law had become a weapon of the well-fed. The anger was as cold and sharp as the winter wind. Every breath taken in the freezing air was a testament to a growing rage that no military force could fully contain. In the eyes of the rioters, the flickering fires of the city were not just for warmth. They were symbols of a burning desire to tear down the walls that separated them from the food they needed to survive. Information was a carrier of both fear and rebellion. Hand-printed broadsides and newspapers traveled through the cold mist, carrying reports of uprisings in distant provinces and the collapse of local authorities. These headlines acted as a catalyst, showing the desperate that they were not alone in their struggle. The ink on the page was a map of a world in crisis, documenting the slow disintegration of the social order as the volcanic winter continued to stifle the Earth's ability to provide. In the shadows of the conflict, a desperate black market emerged. Wealthy families, once secure in their status, were forced to trade their heirlooms and gold for a few pounds of flour. Every transaction was a silent admission of the total collapse of the traditional economy. In this world of ash and ice, gold had no value if it could not be eaten, and the true masters were those who held the keys to the granaries. As night fell, the torches of the rioters illuminated the fog like a hellish procession. The flickering orange light danced against the cold stone of the city, a visual manifestation of a society on the verge of total collapse. There was no leadership, only a collective, desperate momentum that pushed the crowd forward through the dark, icy labyrinth of the urban centers. Symbols of the old world lay broken in the mud. Overturned carriages and discarded finery marked paths where riots had swept through. These scenes of sudden violence were the wreckage of a social hierarchy built on the assumption of reliable harvests and predictable seasons. When the sun failed, the foundations of that hierarchy crumbled, leaving only debris of a lost era scattered across the frozen cobblestones of the great cities, where the struggle for power was now a struggle for survival. Even the enforcers of the law were not immune to the suffering. Weary soldiers, often coming from the same starving families they were ordered to suppress, faced a crisis of conscience. The musket felt heavier with each passing day, as the lines between the protector and the oppressor blurred in the gray twilight. They were as much victims of the volcanic winter as the rioters, trapped in a duty that required them to maintain an order that was starving them to death. As the sun rose on another day of artificial winter, the city bore scars of the night's fury. Smoke from fires merged with the persistent volcanic haze, creating a landscape that looked more like a battlefield than a place of commerce. The riots had not solved the famine, but they had fundamentally altered the relationship between the people and those who ruled them. As the fourth block ends, we see a civilization at the mercy of forces far greater than any king or army. As the frost claimed the valleys of the east, a new and desperate movement began to stir. Thousands of families, having lost their ancestral lands to the relentless cold, turned their eyes toward the horizon. This was the birth of a massive migration, a flight from the frozen ruins of New England and the starving highlands of Europe. They were not seeking gold or glory, but a simple patch of earth where the sun might still have the power to grow a single stalk of corn. The path to survival was paved with iron and struggle. Every turn of the heavy wooden wheels was a battle against a world that had turned into a frozen trap. In the deep slush of the mountain passes, the sounds of cracking ice and straining timber echoed the breaking spirits of those who had left everything behind to chase a rumor of warmth in a landscape that had grown cold. Night on the trail offered no comfort, only a temporary reprieve from the exhausting march. Families huddled around meager fires that struggled to burn in the damp, ash-laden air. Wrapped in every scrap of wool they owned, they stared into the flames as if looking for a sign of the sun's return. These campsites were islands of fragile hope in a vast, dark sea of ice, where the silence of the wilderness was a constant reminder of how far they had wandered from the world they once knew and loved. Navigation was a game of life and death in a landscape without landmarks. In the blinding whiteouts of the unseasonable blizzards, the compass was the only tether to reality. The trembling needle pointed toward a future that was as uncertain as the freezing wind that threatened to extinguish the last of their resolve on the road to the unknown. From the high ridges, the world looked like an endless, white void. There was no green to be seen, no sign of the spring that should have arrived months ago. The lone traveler, standing against the biting wind, represented a humanity that refused to lay down and die, even when the very planet seemed determined to freeze them out of existence. Across the oceans, the migration of souls continued by sea. Crowded ships arrived at unfamiliar ports, vomiting out waves of exhausted refugees who had fled the famines of Ireland and Germany. They stepped onto rain-slicked piers with nothing but their stories and their hunger, ready to build new lives in lands they could barely pronounce. This was the great reshuffling of the human deck, a chaotic movement of millions driven by a volcano they had never seen and a cold they could not escape. In the deep forests of the frontier, the sound of the axe became the rhythm of a new beginning. Men labored in the biting chill to clear land that had never known a plow, building cabins of raw timber to shield their families from eternal winter. Every tree felled was a small victory against the elements, a defiant act of construction in a world that seemed to be falling apart. They were the architects of a new era, forgers of a destiny being written in the frost and the mud of the unknown. And then, in small, isolated pockets, the first signs of resilience appeared. A single green sprout, pushing through the thawing earth, was a miracle that brought strong men to their knees. It was a sign that the ash veil was thinning, and that the earth, though wounded, was still capable of rebirth, offering a fragile promise that the year without a summer might finally be coming to an end. Frontier settlements were lonely outposts of civilization in a world gone cold. From above, the small log cabins looked like tiny sparks in a dark, overwhelming wilderness. Smoke rising from chimneys was a signal of survival, a testament to families who had crossed the mountains to find a place where the frost might finally lose its grip. These humble homes were seeds of future states, planted in the most desperate of times, and watered by the sweat of a generation that refused to break. Inside the cabins, the first harvests were shared with a reverence that bordered on the religious. Every crust of bread was a victory over the famine, a hard-won prize from a land that had fought them every step of the way. The warmth of the fire was no longer just a luxury. It was a sanctuary, a place where the stories of the long migration were told, and the hope for a true summer was finally allowed to breathe. The sun began to set on the most difficult year in history, leaving behind a sky that was still stained with the colors of catastrophe. But as the fifth block ends, the orange light seems to hold a new kind of strength. The volcanic purple was fading, and the world was beginning to emerge from the shadow of the mountain, forever changed by the journey it had been forced to take across the frozen landscape. By spring of 1817, the veil had lifted. The sun, clear and bright for the first time in nearly 2 years, shone down on a world ready to bloom. The year without a summer was over, but its legacy was written in blood and bone of the millions who had moved, the nations that had shifted, and the monsters born in the dark. Life was returning to the valleys, but the memory of the cold would remain, a chilling reminder of how quickly the world can turn into a winter of souls. As the ash finally settled and the skies cleared, the world began to analyze the wreckage of the Great Freeze. Scientists and thinkers of the early 19th century realized they had witnessed a global phenomenon. This collective shock birthed the foundations of modern climatology, as humanity began to understand that a single event could dictate the survival of a civilization on the other side of the planet. Necessity, the mother of invention, bloomed in the aftermath of the famine. With the mass death of horses across Europe, a German inventor named Karl Dreis sought a way to move without animal power. The result was the Laufmaschine, the world's first bicycle. This wooden contraption was a direct response to the collapse of the oats harvest, proving that even in our darkest winters, the human spirit finds a way to move forward, turning a global catastrophe into a revolution of mobility. The return of the summer was not just a change in weather, it was a resurrection. By 1818, the green of the valleys was deeper than ever, fueled by the volcanic minerals that had once threatened to starve the world. The fields that were graveyards for cattle became nurseries for new life, showing the incredible, albeit violent, cycle of planetary renewal that governs our existence and our very survival. Today, the giant of Sumbawa sits in silence, its jagged caldera a massive scar on the face of Earth. From the air, the crater of Mount Tambora is a breathtaking reminder of the power contained within our planet. It is no longer a source of terror, but a monument to a moment when nature reminded us of our fragility. The jungle has reclaimed the slopes where the fire once flowed, but the shadow of 1815 still looms in the geological record, a sleeping titan that once brought the world to its knees. The monsters born in the dark stayed with us long after the sun returned. The literary legacy of that cold summer, from the horrors of Frankenstein to the melancholic poetry of Byron, became the foundation of Romanticism. We learned to find beauty in the sublime and the terrifying, realizing that our greatest art often emerges from our deepest despairs, etched into the cultural DNA of humanity by the frost of 1816. We are now the watchers of the sky. The legacy of the year without a summer lives on in our modern obsession with climate monitoring. We have replaced the desperate prayers of the past with the precise data of satellites and sensors, forever vigilant for the next veil of ash. We understand now that the climate is a fragile balance, and the lessons of Tambora serve as a haunting warning of how quickly the world we know can be stripped away by forces beyond our control. Looking back at the survivors of 1816, we see a reflection of our own resilience. They faced a world that had turned its back on them and refused to break. Their struggle is our inheritance, a story of endurance that reminds us that no matter how dark the sky becomes, the human capacity for adaptation is the ultimate light that guides us through the frozen unknown and the silence of the winter. The story of the frozen summer is a letter from the past, sealed with the ash of a volcano and the sweat of millions. It tells us that our civilization is a thin layer of warmth over a planet of fire and ice. To read this story is to understand the true cost of our comfort and the hidden history of the ground we walk upon. It is a chronicle of survival that continues to echo through the halls of history, reminding us to never take the return of the sun for granted. Every dawn is a victory over the darkness. As the sun rises over our modern world, we are the beneficiaries of those who endured the long winter. The year without a summer was a test of the soul, a global trial that forged a more connected and curious humanity. We have emerged from the shadow of the mountain stronger, wiser, and forever aware of the fire that burns beneath our feet. As we conclude this journey into the cold heart of 1816, we invite you to reflect on the power of the earth and the grit of our ancestors. History is not just a collection of dates, but a living record of our collective survival. Join us next time on the Chronicle Prime as we continue to uncover the stories that shaped our world. Don't forget to like and subscribe to keep the light of history burning and the stories of our endurance alive. In the end, the summer did return. The wheat grew tall once more, and the children who had known only the cold finally felt the warmth of a clear sun. The year without a summer became a story told by elders, a legend of the time the world went dark. But for those who lived through it, the lessons of that frozen year remained a deep, abiding respect for the power of nature and a knowledge that even the longest winter must eventually yield to the spring. The sky remains clear, but the memory of the ash lingers in the wind. We are the children of the sun, forever mindful of the mountain of fire that once stole the summer. Our journey continues under the watch of a star that we no longer take for granted.